China just sent warships around Australia without warning. Yikes. For nearly a month, a Chinese flotilla circled the country, sailing past major cities and even conducting live fire drills, without telling Australia or its allies. A training exercise? A power move? Or a warning? Whatever China's intentions, Australian officials were caught off guard, and the implications go far beyond just military posturing. So what was Beijing trying to prove, and what does it mean for Australia's security? Let's break it down. We'll begin with a rundown of what actually happened, before digging into the possible meaning behind it and what it might indicate for Australia, its allies, and the broader region moving forward. According to reporting by the New York Times and other publications, early in February of this year, a flotilla of Chinese warships crossed the Torres Strait north of Australia. The flotilla was made up of 3 vessels total: the destroyer CNS Zunyi, the frigate CNS Hengyang, and a replenishment ship called CNS Waishanhu. It didn't take long for the Australian Defence Force to spot these ships and start tracking them, with support from New Zealand. They watched on as the flotilla began a full circumnavigation of Australia. It started by sailing south along the eastern side of the nation. That's where the vast majority of the Aussie population resides, in coastal cities like Brisbane and Sydney. The sudden and unexpected sight of Chinese warships off the coast of Sydney was worrying enough for the Australian people, and a sense of unease was beginning to settle in. But the situation was about to take a much more dramatic turn. The most concerning part of all is that the Aussie Defence Force had absolutely no idea. On February 21st, a commercial passenger jet, Virgin Flight 161, travelled from Sydney, Australia to Queenstown, New Zealand, and it was flying above the Chinese flotilla in the Tasman Sea. On the jet's radio, the pilot heard a warning from the Chinese ships, revealing they were about to start live fire exercises. Concerned, the pilot quickly called the news to the Australian Aviation Authority, which issued a hazard alert and rapidly scrambled to divert any and all flights passing through the area. Literally dozens of planes, 46 in total, had to be diverted that day to avoid any potential danger from the warship's weapons. And the radio warning was not a mere drill or an error. At around 9:30 in the morning, the Chinese ships did indeed begin to fire, blasting destructive weapons across the waters, a mere 300 nautical miles from the Aussie coastline and millions of people. With the live fire drills completed, the flotilla proceeded around the edge of Australia. It passed along the southern coast, sailing in and out of Australia's exclusive economic zone waters, which are those that Australia has exclusive, sovereign rights to use for fishing, fuel, and other purposes. By March 4th, the flotilla had arrived near Perth, the biggest city on Australia's western coast. It also reached its closest point to the mainland, just 170 nautical miles away, before proceeding north and eventually leaving the Australian area on its way toward Indonesia. Over the course of a month, the Chinese warships had sailed all around Australia. This was not normal. In fact, it was unprecedented. It was the first time that China had sent any of its naval vessels so far south for training exercises. The nature of the flotilla's movement was also unexpected, as China had given no advance notice to either Australia or New Zealand about its planned activities. Nor had it felt the need to alert the Australian government or military about its intent to conduct live-fire exercises, and it was only thanks to that one pilot that the country was alerted and aviation authorities were able to take action. So what does it all mean? Well, if we take China's word for it, then the whole thing is being overblown by the media. Zhao Qian, China's ambassador to Australia, announced, "As a major power in this region, as a country that has so many things to look after, it is normal for China to send their vessels to different parts of the region to conduct various kinds of activities." In other words, he was saying that China has the right to send its ships where it likes, and there was no need for the Australians or anyone else to get worked up about it. There's also, from the Chinese perspective, no need for the country to issue any sort of apology or explanation. It was simply conducting routine training exercises, which it regularly does in other waters around Asia and the Indo-Pacific region. From one angle, there is some credence to China's standpoint. Technically, there was nothing illegal about what they did. While Australia exerts exclusive fishing and management rights over its exclusive economic zone waters, ships from other nations are still free to sail within them. China was well within its rights to send the ships on that route, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with them sailing all the way around Australia either. Yet China's choice to do this is an unusual one, and the decision to give no notice about the live fire exercises is even stranger. Typically, military forces will give approximately 24 to 48 hours of notice to relevant governments before conducting any such exercise. This is just one reason why Australia has taken quite a critical and concerned view of these events. Andrew Shearer, Director General of Australia's Office of National Intelligence, called the move a provocative one. He stated, "Our preliminary view is that the deployment demonstrates China's growing capability to project military power into our immediate region, now matched by an increasing intent to do so. And at least some of its activities seem designed to be provocative. We judge Beijing intends to normalize this sort of presence, shape the response of those in the region, and observe and learn from our reactions." Judith Collins, Defence Minister of New Zealand, echoed Shearer's concerns, stating, "The weapons they have are extremely capable," while noting that such a strong Chinese force had never been seen in that area before. Within Australia, there has been much outcry over the situation. Certain parts of the media have criticised the Defence Force for its lack of intel regarding the situation, and Admiral David Johnson, the Defence Force chief, was forced to admit to Parliament that the force was only made aware of the live-fire exercises 28 minutes after they had started, thanks to the tip-off from the Virgin pilot. This highlights a worrying lack of awareness among the Defence Force, especially after it claimed it was closely monitoring the ships from the moment they entered Aussie waters. So questions have to be asked. How did the Defence Force not know about any live fire if it was apparently tracking the ships the whole time? It also plays into underlying fears, which have now been exacerbated about the relative weakness of the Australian naval force compared to the growing Chinese one. Indeed, one of the most damning statistics to emerge in the wake of this story is this. The small flotilla of Chinese ships had 144 missile launchers between them, and that's just a tiny fraction of the full force of China's navy. In contrast, Australia's entire fleet of warships has just 200 launchers in total. To make matters worse on the Aussie side, both of the country's fuel tankers, which are vital for sustaining any sort of long-range operation, are out of action at the moment. In other words, at a time when China's naval force is stronger than it's ever been, Australia is at one of its weakest points. And while improvements have been announced to the Aussie Navy, those won't be seen for at least another 5 years, if not much longer. And this might be part of the reason why China decided to flex its naval muscle in this way. Many people have seen the entire act as one of dominance, a way for China to prove that it can send its warships wherever it wants, when it wants, with remarkable speed, force, and efficiency, and nearby countries can do very little in response. In doing this, China isn't just showing off its power, it's also proving that if it ever wanted to, say, block key trade routes around Australia or surrounding waters, it could. Or even more dramatically, if it ever wanted to invade Australia and sustain a prolonged naval attack on the nation, it absolutely has the power to do just that. Rowan Moffat, former Deputy Chief of the Australian Navy, summed this up in worrying words. He said, "They are gradually but very steadily spreading their wings, showing the world they're able to be anywhere they want to be, whenever they choose. We see no reason to suggest an intent to use their capability against us today. Should the intent change, they could." Within Australian politics, the country's government has also come under fire in the wake of the warships movements. Critics have targeted Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, who has focused a lot of his efforts on stabilizing relations with China after tensions boiled over during the COVID-19 pandemic. Back then, Australia called for a major international inquiry into the outbreak of the virus and China's initial response to it, which China didn't take too kindly to. In response, in 2020, China imposed multiple restrictions on Aussie exports, dealing a big blow to the country's economy and trade. Tensions rose rapidly between the two nations, and Australia began to lean more heavily on the US for protection and support. Albanese entered office in 2022 and took steps to calm the country's burgeoning rivalry with China. But some critics have called this approach too soft. Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie, for example, said that China had put Australia to the test and that Albanese had failed. Hastie claimed that if Australia had done the same sort of thing in the South China Sea and disrupted the Chinese commercial flight paths, we'd have hell to pay as a country. Others have echoed Hastie's comments. Marcus Hellier, a senior analyst focusing on defense economics and military capability, was particularly scathing, stating, "The Chinese are showing us up in our own backyard, and we can't even sail around our own country. They are really rubbing it in." However, supporters of Albanese have argued that there was little point in any sort of retaliation. Albanese himself has also pointed out that Australian naval vessels have often sailed through the South China Sea, and that both countries are within their rights to send vessels where they wish for training and similar purposes. Meanwhile, as Australian politicians argue over the situation, mere weeks before the nation's next federal election, many experts have expressed concern about a deeper meaning behind China's actions. Several have pointed out the intriguing timing of the flotilla's voyage. It occurred not long after an American nuclear submarine docked at a naval base not far from Perth in Western Australia. An important US military official was also visiting Canberra, the Australian capital at the time. It could therefore be interpreted that China was not just making a statement to Australia, but also to the United States by showing off its naval might. This might be a direct response to the recent wave of tariffs that the US has imposed on China, among other nations. What's more, all of these actions have occurred just shortly into the second presidential term of Donald Trump, who has ushered in some major shifts to US foreign policy. Trump has clearly taken an America-first approach. He has demonstrated this quite clearly by cutting aid to Ukraine in a move that effectively aids Russia's aggression in Europe and puts the continent into a more perilous position. Because of this, questions have arisen about how committed the US under Trump will be to securing peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. Or would Trump take a similar approach and let countries like Taiwan and even Australia fend for themselves if China decided to expand its reach or even pursue an invasion? Such an idea might sound fantastical, but there are grounds for people in this part of the world to be fearful, and the idea of China taking military action isn't beyond the realms of possibility. Indeed, a lot of signs suggest that China could have some dramatic long-term plans ahead. It's been notably expanding its naval force in recent years, building a colossal fleet of warships with enough weaponry to dwarf any other force in Asia. And we've seen those ships not just in Australian waters, but in other areas too. In recent times, for example, there have been reports of Chinese warships sailing around Vietnam, Taiwan, and Japan on numerous occasions. Japan's defense minister even recently revealed that Chinese ships were spotted in the waters around the Ryukyu Islands, a small chain separating Japan and Taiwan, a whopping 68 times in 2024. For the sake of comparison, China's ships were only seen in that area 21 times in 2021. This is yet another example of how China is pushing its naval forces further and further, making more and more trips and training exercises, and perhaps seeing how far it can expand without facing any real retaliation. What's more, it's well known that Chinese leader Xi Jinping hopes to one day take over Taiwan entirely. The country could then seek further gains in the future to expand its influence and strengthen its global standing, especially if the US does not stand in its way. Peter Harcher, writing in the Sydney Morning Herald, summed it up well, stating, "China's navy is illustrating Australia's vulnerability at the exact moment that the US is demonstrating American unreliability. In theory, Australia shouldn't have too much to be concerned about thanks to the AUKUS agreement. AUKUS is a security pact between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the US aimed at promoting security and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. It was brought into action in 2021 during the Biden administration, and a big part of the AUKUS agreement involves America sending nuclear-powered submarines to Australia as a powerful deterrent to any Chinese military actions. However, as stated, AUKUS came in under Biden. Trump is not at all the same sort of president and has proven that he is more than willing to undo actions taken by his predecessor. Worries about that very issue were compounded earlier this year when, during a press conference, Trump was asked if he discussed the AUKUS initiative with the British Prime Minister. Trump appeared to have little knowledge of the agreement, responding, "What does that mean?" Since then, Trump officials have downplayed the president's comments. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says that Trump is very aware and supportive of the AUKUS agreement, and given that Australia has already paid the US over $500 million toward the aforementioned nuclear subs, AUKUS generally represents a pretty good deal for America, so there's little reason to believe that Trump might renege on it. A US defense official also stated that Hegseth and the administration have been closely following the events in Australia, stating, "We are aware of these activities and are closely monitoring. As Secretary Hegseth has said, China is a peer competitor with the capability and intent to threaten our core national interests in the Indo-Pacific, and the department prioritizes deterring China." China, however, appears undeterred. On X, the Chinese embassy recently tweeted, "If war is what the US wants, be it a tariff war or a trade war or any other type of war, we're ready to fight until the end." It was a bold proclamation and a sign of China's increasing power and confidence in its position. It was also yet another sign of rising tensions between China, the US, and other Western nations, Australia included. And all of these factors put Australia in a very uncertain and challenging position. Since he came to power, Prime Minister Albanese has tried to walk the line between China and the US, performing a delicate balancing act along the way. He's worked hard to ease relations with Xi Jinping on the one hand, while also pursuing initiatives like AUKUS to gain protection and support from the US and other allies. But now Australia faces something of a crisis, and that balancing act is about to become a lot harder to maintain. The flotilla may have been a small one and nobody was hurt by its actions, yet it's clear that a precedent has now been set. China's navy is only getting stronger, and it's spreading further and further across the region, into waters that were once far beyond its reach. This was the first time we saw Chinese warships so far south, but it certainly may not be the last. And with each expansion, China sends a message of strength, superiority, and dominance that no other nation, bar the US, can rival. But now we ask you, should Australia continue to work towards better connections with China to improve trade, the economy, and general stability? Or should it work more on improving its relationship with the Trump administration to ensure it will remain safe, secure, and guarded by the powerful American military? Or, as many within the country feel, does Australia need to focus more on itself? Should it be prioritizing its own military force, putting more money and energy into improving its navy and fortifying its enormous coastline and maritime territory? While Australia grapples with those dilemmas and works out the best next steps, let us know what you think. And thank you, as always, for watching.